Thanks so much, John. I was just delighted to be asked to speak as part of the series, and am thrilled that so many of you wanted to venture out of your homes this season. I think we all want to just kind of burrow in and keep warm, so thanks for coming out for this program. As John said, I'm on the faculty of Valparaiso University. I teach French, and I am not a historian, but I discovered this topic which has really taken me into the history of this area and brings together, obviously, my love and appreciation for things French and the fact that I'm a Hoosier, and there are interesting connections between those. So that's what has led to the work that I have done on this for about the past 10 years. I will be talking about Joseph Bailey, but kind of towards the end of the presentation, because he is the latest of the French and French Canadians to show up in our area. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the origins of the presence of French people right here, and then talk specifically about a couple of places that I'm sure you know about, but might not know a lot about the French connections in the state of Indiana, not just the Kankakee area, but really throughout the state. Elizabeth noticed these maps, or these flags up here, and I thought, well, let's explain these. Obviously, we've got Indiana on the top, and on the bottom we have the current French flag, but in the middle we have the flag with the fleur-de-lis on it, the symbol of French royalty. And that was the flag that flew over this territory from the 17th century to the middle of the 18th century. And in fact, where we're sitting now, 300 years ago, this was France. So we would have been speaking French if we weren't speaking a Native American language. Very gradually, the French made their presence known here. We'll talk about that. And then, very suddenly, in the middle of the 18th century, it was no longer France. It was Britain and then United States. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So next slide, please. Just press one of the buttons. There we go. State of Indiana, these are the places that I'll be talking about, some in more detail than others. These are all places where the French were at some point. And I also know that in the audience I have some folks who are experts in some of these things. So there are probably people here who know as much or perhaps even more than I do about some of these things. And I invite your wisdom as well. But I have Porter on there because that's where the Bailey homestead is. Michigan City, we'll talk about that very briefly. Fort St. Joseph may be something you don't know about. It's in Michigan, but just barely north of South Bend. Importance of South Bend, you all know about that perhaps. We'll talk about the portage there. Fort Wayne actually was a French fort. Long before it was Fort Wayne, there was a French fort there. Vivi down in the southeast part of the state, settled by French-speaking Swiss. I'll talk just a little tiny bit about that. And then coming here, of course, we've got the Wabash River coming down with Ouiatenon by West Lafayette. Terre Haute, Terre Haute, we've got some French presence there. And then, of course, Vincennes, or with the French pronunciation, Vincennes. So those are the spots that I will be talking about. Next, please. Very beginnings of the French presence in North America. I won't spend too much time on this because they didn't get here right away. But nonetheless, it's important to recognize when the French were exploring. They were part of that whole European exploration period when folks in Europe thought we can enrich ourselves, we can find a passage to Asia, and we can have new colonies and new power. So they were part of Spain, France, Portugal, all of those countries that were sending explorers over. They were hoping to find gold, they were hoping to find spices, which was a very rich export product, and they were hoping, as I said, to find the passage to Asia. The first important sort of major French explorer, a name you've probably heard before, Jacques Cartier. And you can see he was born in 1491. He was born just 1 year before Columbus sailed the ocean blue, as we know, and lived till the mid-1500s. He made 3 voyages to North America and sailed around the coast. I'll show you maps in just a second. He did not found a colony, but he did go up the St. Lawrence River to the site of what is today Montreal. So he really established a kind of a French knowledge of and willingness to explore that part of North America. and that was going to be important for our part of the country. A couple of maps, I'm sorry they're so fuzzy, you know how resolution goes when you size things up, but I think you can tell we've got the St. Lawrence up here, Atlantic, and this is obviously Newfoundland and all of that part of Canada. So you can see his first and second voyages, and on that second voyage he did make it all the way here to what is currently Montreal, and there were rapids, so he didn't go any farther, turned around and went back. Well, why would you want to stay in America? They kept trying to find a passage to Asia, the Northwest Passage. They worked on that, as did the British, for many years. But beyond that, they discovered that there was something very, very economically viable that they could import into Europe, and that was the natural resources of fur. So that the fur trade, they realized, could become a real source of wealth. They sent some settlers, which in French are called habitants, or people living here, habitants. By the way, if any of you are hockey fans, Montreal Canadiens, I always wondered, why do they call this team, they call them the Habs, H-A-B-S, and I couldn't figure that out, and I realized it's for habitants. It took me a while, but that's where that comes from. So there was some sense that you could do some agriculture here, but most of the early French settlements were very far north, and that was extremely difficult to establish themselves agriculturally. And of course they could also continue their exploration with a base in North America. You could continue to explore, see if there might be metals that could be mined, see if you could find that passage to Asia, whatever else there might be that you could take back to Europe. Colonization began in the 17th century. Samuel de Champlain was the first one who was sent over to found a colony. Made his first trip in 1603, and then in 1606 he and a few people founded the first colony in North America, Quebec City. And you can see here, this is a stamp that I photographed a few years ago commemorating the 400th anniversary of the founding of Quebec City and the first presence of the French on North America. And he continued to return. He lived for a while in Quebec City, and exploration continued. So that was really the first foothold of the French in North America in terms of actually staying and setting down some roots. The next name that's really important for exploration of this area and the presence of the French comes quite a number of years later, when there's a pretty solid settlement in what we would call Canada today, along the St. Lawrence River, with not just Quebec City but also Montreal. And the exploration of this huge territory, which they wanted to claim, was continuing. And a number of French explorers went out. You have probably heard of Duluth, Minnesota. Duluth was a French explorer. You've heard of Nicolette, perhaps, Nicolet, Radisson, who was not, he did not found a series of hotels, but he was an explorer. But those are French names from the Minnesota area that are all very familiar to us and that show that French presence. Right around here, however, Father Marquette is a name that we're very familiar with. You can see his birth and death dates there. He came to Canada in 1666 and was very active in founding missions, Catholic missions. One up in Sault Ste. Marie and one at St. Ignace. Those of you who have been up to Mackinac know that St. Ignace is the little town that's just on the other side of the Mackinac Bridge, up on the Upper Peninsula, right across from Mackinac City, Michigan. And that was the original mission, the Catholic mission that he founded up there. He then traveled with Joliet, and I spell it the old-fashioned French way, with two L's. We know it better as Joliet, famous city in Illinois. And they set out together with a number of men to try to find the mouth of the Mississippi. They came down through Green Bay, and then in the Fox and Wisconsin rivers came through to the Mississippi and followed the Mississippi south. They only got as far as the Arkansas River, where the Arkansas River meets with the Mississippi, partly because they could see that this river was heading south And they knew that if they were going to get through to Asia, they needed to be turning west. And this river did not look like it was turning west. And they were also encountering some Native Americans who did not want them in this territory and were being quite hostile. And they said, okay, this is not what we need, we're going to head back north. So they then did not get to the mouth of the Mississippi, but did some exploring and sort of claiming of that territory for France. In 1674, Marquette returned because he wanted to found some more missions in the Illinois River area, so in sort of west and central Illinois. He did that, spent the winter at Chicago, you can tell what that is, and then he fell ill after that winter in Chicago. Maybe we know why, after this winter. And he was on his way returning back to the mission up at St. Ignace, and he fell ill. He was, the route that he took, you're probably aware of this, was really following the southern shore of Lake Michigan. He fell very ill then up in the state of Michigan, today, what is today the state of Michigan, and died there. And so the Père Marquette River sort of commemorates the spot approximately where he died. So that's a name that we certainly associate with this area because he was right up here on the shores of Lake Michigan. Next, please. So just a reminder, this is the route that he was taking to try to get back up north. A little reminder of where we are. Next slide. A couple of reminders of the French presence in Canada and the city of Montreal, which was founded a few years after Quebec City, on the site of an Indian village which was called Hochelaga. So there were rapids there, which kind of stopped your progress down the, or I should say up the St. Lawrence River. So a second major French settlement was begun there in the first half of the 1600s. But just a little reminder, the French were sending out map makers, and here we can almost see ourselves over here on this part of this French map. Next, please. Next explorer who came through here is one who I think is familiar to a lot of you, Robert René Cavelier Sieur de LaSalle, or LaSalle, as we know him. You have his birth and death dates there. He came to Canada in 1666, was a very, very active explorer, military man, and he founded a number of defensive forts around the upper Great Lakes area. And in 1682, he headed up an expedition that wanted to do more exploring of the Mississippi. They wanted to see, where does this huge river flow into the sea? Does it really keep going south? Maybe it would become a passage to Asia, we don't know. So he set out at the head of an expedition, and many of you know that he came down Lake Michigan, then into the St. Joseph River at St. Joe Benton Harbor, took it down to the Kankakee River, or the Teakiki, or the Aukiki, or however you want to pronounce it. And as you probably know, at current today's South Bend, the two rivers are not too far apart, about a mile apart, and that's the portage that they took then so that they could continue their trip towards the Mississippi River. They then took the Kankakee, passing right through here, through the marshes, down through the Illinois River system and the Mississippi, and then they ultimately did find the mouth of the Mississippi at the Gulf of Mexico. And LaSalle is then the one who very formally took a flag and planted it and said, I claim this territory in the name of the King of France, who was King, you may remember, Louis XIV. Hence, all of this territory became Louisiana because LaSalle had claimed it for his king. LaSalle, I won't spend much time on this, but LaSalle was apparently a very unpleasant guy. His men killed him. So he died a very ignominious death in the swamps of the bayou, the swamps and bayous of where the mouth of the Mississippi. So an unpleasant guy all around. Nonetheless, he is one reason why were we here 400 years ago. 300 years ago, this would have been France. So, next slide, please. Just another reminder. So this shows you the extent of the French territory, and this part is called Louisiana, this northern part is called Canada, and the whole thing is called New France, La Nouvelle France. Various other parts of it named as well, but you can see it was really a huge territory. And we will take a look at some other maps as well, but you can see there's really a huge amount of territory that the French claimed, but there were not very many French people who came to live here. The entire population was numbered really in the tens and later barely hundreds of thousands of French people living in this territory. Of course, there were already people here. We need to not forget that. This was not an unpopulated territory, and I'll talk a little bit about the interactions between the French and the Native Americans because it's a very, very interesting story. Next. What dominated in the 17th and 18th centuries with the French presence in this part of North America was obviously the fur trade. This is a French map from the early 1700s, and you can see here's our area, Lac Michigan, we have here, Lac Supérieur, and down here we have the different areas named for the Native Americans who resided there. So this is called Pays des Miamis, country of the Miami Indians. This is Pays des Renards, country of the fox. This is Pays des Mascoutins, the Mascoutins were over here. Pays des Illinois, the Illini were down here. So the French are very much identifying these parts of their territory by the people who were already living here and with whom they were trading, working, living, and marrying at that point. And if you look here, you can see, these look like little mountains. Do we have any mountains down here around Couts? These sort of little bumps. But this is indeed the Kankakee River running right through here. So there it is on this. I believe this is a 1712 French map. Let me tell you a little bit about the fur trade and how it worked because it was so important for the French presence here. The fur trade out of this part of New France happened through Montreal. If you were farther south, the furs might get sent down the Mississippi out by New Orleans and then over to Europe. But in this part of New France, things were going up north to Montreal. And what happened was, and some of you probably know something about how the fur trade worked, but when I first started learning this, I didn't know a thing, so it was all new to me. What happened was obviously all of the trade goods, the manufactured goods that were going to get traded for the furs, came by boat to Montreal, came from Europe to Montreal. It was in Montreal that a person like Joseph Bailey or other fur traders would sort of place an order for all of the trade goods that they wanted to have to trade during a season. So in Montreal, all of these trade goods, the blankets that John was talking about earlier, the pans and the kettles and the gunpowder and the beads and the fabric, all of that would get loaded up into canoes, which would be sent out to the major trading posts. The major trading posts would be, for instance, up here at Mackinac, or up here at Sault Ste. Marie. Detroit was a fairly major one. Grand Portage up on Lake Superior, those were sort of big trading posts. So as soon as the ice broke up on the rivers in Canada in the spring, the large canoes would set out with the trade goods from Montreal, and they followed this route, not through Niagara Falls, not surprisingly, but they took the Ottawa River and came down through Lake Nipissing and Georgian Bay into Lake Huron and from there on out. So Joseph Bailey, who I'll be talking about, was based for much of his career up at Mackinac. So he would receive the goods that he had ordered from his partner in Montreal, and he would then divide up those trade goods into a number of smaller expeditions. He would have, say, 4 or 5 groups of men, expeditions, that he was going to send out and they would be working independently. So he would divide up the goods, he would hire the men to go out on the boats and the canoes, and much of his work was done in the state of Michigan. So he would maybe have two parties who were coming out here, someone who was coming down to the Kankakee area. He did a little bit of trading over in Wisconsin as well. But these smaller parties then would load up with the men and the trade goods in the canoes, and they would leave Mackinac in the late summer. They would head down to whatever their endpoint was, a sort of small trading post, which would not be a permanent place, but a fairly temporary sort of improvised shelter almost. And they would spend the winter there. They had the trade goods. The Native Americans would bring the furs in and would trade for these goods during the winter. In the spring, then, they would pack up their furs, and as soon as the ice went out again, because of course all this is happening on water, as soon as the ice went out again, they would head back up to Mackinac, arriving there kind of midsummer. Joseph Bailey would aggregate all of his furs from all of these different expeditions and send them then back up to Montreal, and from Montreal they would head over to Europe. So you can see this is really a very long economic cycle. You start in Montreal with the first canoes coming down with the trade goods in, say, April or May. You take the whole year, and the furs don't get back up to Montreal until really the beginning of the following fall. So it's quite remarkable when you think of the length of that economic cycle, and I compare that with when I bought that computer. You know, I went online and ordered it, and it came from China in a week. So what a difference. Economic things work a tad differently today, in some areas at least. So that gives you an idea of what the fur trade cycle was like. Major trading posts I mentioned, Michilimackinac, as it was known then. It was a fort, a military fort, but also very important trading post. And with St. Ignace then up on the north shore. Detroit was an important one also for our area. Chicago, not really during the French period. There was a tiny settlement there, but it was not a major trading post during the French time of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. Posts in Indiana, which were more or less permanent because they had a military presence with them. I mentioned Fort St. Joseph. I'll talk about that in a moment, just north of what is today South Bend. Fort Miami, which was a fort and trading post very close to what is today Fort Wayne, so that's over in that part of the state. Fort Ouiatenon on the Wabash down by Lafayette. Probably many of you have been down to the Feast of the Hunter's Moon down there. And then Poste Vincennes, Fort or Poste Vincennes, which is the only one of these that really became a major settlement and has stayed a town since it was settled by the French. So there you have an idea of where these things are. And importantly, they are all on waterways. Not surprising. The highways of the 18th century. Next, please. So the posts in Indiana, I've mentioned that a number of them also, and I think all of them also had a military function. They really had kind of a dual function. The commercial function was important. First of all, the French and the English were really competing with each other to trade with the Indians for the furs. Who would offer the better prices for the furs? Who had the better quality goods? It was a real struggle. There's a very interesting set of documents, letters that were written by the administrators and military folks here in New France, back to France. You can read those. They're available online if you can read Old French. And Old French handwriting, you can see them. It's fascinating to see the ways in which they say, we think the English are encroaching on our territory in this way. They're working with this Indian leader and this Indian leader, and so we really need to do something about that. There's absolute competition between the two countries. So there was a commercial function. These were military posts, but there were also places where you could have a settled spot where the Indians would know they could come to trade their furs. So it was a place of some permanence. And it was a place where the Indians tended to settle, often where there was a post. Sometimes you would install a post, a trading post, where there were already Indian villages, but if that was not the case, then very soon an Indian village would be built up near the trading post. As I mentioned, they were on rivers, often at portages. Those were important, you know, it was Interstate 8094 back in the day. The posts were inhabited by just a few soldiers and their commander, and you'll see how few in a couple of minutes. I've got a few statistics, but we're really talking about a couple of dozen at most. There would be a few traders there, again, maybe 5, 10 sort of permanently stationed fur traders. The Indian settlements would have been nearby, and obviously since France was a Catholic country and the Jesuits in particular, there were some other Recollet fathers also who did mission work here, but there were priests who were traveling around and they would stop by occasionally. For the most part, there was not a church as such associated with these. The one exception is Vincennes, which was more of a town. But there would be traveling priests, so there would be that presence occasionally. You probably know that the Indians that lived here already when the French came, the Wia, the Piankashaw, the Miami, Potawatomi, and Mascoutin were the principal people in the area here. And I know that there are people who know much more about that than I do. I won't attempt to go into that very much at all. So let me start with Fort Miami. You'll remember that this is the one that's over near what is today Fort Wayne. The very earliest one, founded in 1680, was Fort St. Joseph, and that one is up on the St. Joe River. People have found where they think it is, but they won't tell the general public because they don't want people digging around in it. But it's north of today's South Bend. They wanted to establish a post that would be farther to the south, again, in order to counter the English and to compete with them for the furs. And they wanted to have it be kind of a magnet so that they would know that they could draw a lot of Indians to this area. So they chose a site where three rivers kind of meet over in this area near what's today Fort Wayne. They would have some access to Detroit fairly easily that way. Also some access through rivers and portaging and down the Wabash, etc., to the country of the Illinois, le pays des Illinois, the country of the Illini Indians, and also to Lake Michigan. So through waterways, they had a number of different options from this spot. And there were some Indian villages. It was called Kekionga, and that was already established there. So there were a number of reasons to want to establish that post right there. The person who was associated with this has a familiar name to many of you, Jean-Baptiste Bissot, Sieur de Vincennes, Lord of Vincennes. In fact, there's a father and a son, and this is the father that you have here. He first came to Fort St. Joseph in 1696-97, and he turned out to be a very savvy negotiator. He worked very easily and very well with the Miami Indians, had a pretty good relationship with them. And in 1750, he was asked to go to this post at Kekionga, and so it was under his leadership that the fort was really established, constructed then in 1721. So you can think about the dates that we had before. There's already been a city up at Quebec City for 100 years by the time they're starting to kind of build forts and kind of permanent presence here in this part of North America. Now, I asked myself, why is he called Lord Vincennes? Was he some aristocrat from France? And in fact, no, he was not. What happened was this. When people came to live in Canada, the king would often grant them, if they were of enough standing, the king would grant them a concession of land, usually fronting on the river. And these concessions were called seigneuries, or sort of lordship areas, because you were the lord of that area. Did not mean that you were an aristocrat as such, but just that you had this area of land. You could call it whatever you wanted. And most of these people, of course, called them maybe after their family territory back in France, or a place name that was familiar to them from France. And this family happened to call theirs Vincennes. Vincennes is an area, an area right outside Paris today. It was a little farther outside Paris back in the 1700s, but that's how that happens. There were tenants who lived on the land. Usually the lords did not live on the land, but were tenant farmers. And these sort of tenant farmers were the habitants, inhabitants. So that's how that name came to be. So they were sieurs, they were lords, they were rich in land, but they were not old nobility from France. So that was news to me. I always wondered why all these aristocrats had come over. Well, some of them were, but not all of them were when they got here. So father and son, the one that we've been talking about, who was first at Fort St. Joseph and then founded Fort Miami, died in 1718 or 1719, not quite sure. And his son took over the command of the fort. Now, if you take a look at the dates here, you can see that the father, Jean-Baptiste Bissot, died in 1719, and you can see his son, François-Marie, was born in 1700. So how old was he when he took over command of the fort? He was 18 or 19 years old. Apparently a very talented guy, and I think you took who you could get at that point. But he did very well for himself. I think he had learned very well from his father, because he went on to become the commander of a number of other spots as well. This is just to show you what some of these letters look like that tell about what's going on here in present-day Indiana, in this part of New France. And this is one, the top line of it says, "Nous commandons pour le roi au fort Saint-Philippe de Miami." We, commander for the king at the Fort Saint Philippe of the Miami. In that beginning of that second line, you might just be able to make that out, and that is Fort Miami. So here is the commander who is writing. This is not a very crucial document. It says, there's a gentleman who took a message for you, please pay him. So essentially a kind of a economic or financial note there. But it's interesting because it mentions this fort right here in Indiana. And the date in that is 1725. So that's the date in that letter. It's written out in letters at the bottom. So you can see the beautiful handwriting and the kind of correspondence that was going on. So Fort Miami, even though most people have not heard of it, was really a crucial fort. It was very important for the fur trade in this part of the upper Midwest. Between 1730 and 1740, 10% of, oops, there's some French on there, I'm sorry. Part of this presentation I did in French before, and so here you have a French word. 10% of the furs that were taken from west of the Niagara came through this fort. They passed through that fort. And again, it was a meeting point. You could go to Detroit, you could head off to Lake Michigan, you could head down to the Illinois country. So it was, you can imagine a place where furs came to and then would get shipped off to Montreal. Next, post Ouiatenon. Some of you have probably been there on the Wabash, also known as the Wabash. That's how the French spelled it at the time. It was constructed in 1717, and François Picot de Belestre was the commander there. You can see the number of men that were involved in building this fort. 4 soldiers, 3 civilians, and 1 blacksmith. So we're not talking a huge fort here. And there are documents that describe the number, the people that were involved in this. This post on the Wabash River gave the French access to the land of the Illinois, very rich in furs, and also gave them some access to that route down south. By this time, the city of New Orleans had been founded, and so that was a really viable route to try to get furs out if you were going to go that direction and not back up north to Montreal. So this became a very interesting fort from that point of view. It was on the north bank of the Wabash, and there was a village of Huilles on the other side. It was commanded by François-Marie Bissot, Sieur de Vincennes, beginning in 1723. So you can see he didn't let any grass grow under his feet. He didn't stay at Fort Miami for too long. He then continued here to be the commander of Post Huilles. The post itself had a wooden palisade. This is a photo of contemporary, the building at Fort Huilles down at that park. And the French palisade and buildings would not have looked like that at all. You may be aware the French had a very different building style. They had posts that were stuck vertically into the ground. Some of them were called post in ground because they literally went into the ground. Sometimes they laid a sill on the ground and the posts were fastened to that sill, and that is a style that's called post en sill, not surprisingly. So this horizontally laid logs was not the look of things in the French. Obviously the palisade was going to be like this, but even the buildings would have been these vertically mounted posts. Who would have been there? A few residents, not very many, maybe a dozen, couple dozen people. Obviously the Indians were there, and as you can see, we have a census in 1746, 20 French people and 100 Indians, and those French people would have been a mixture of a few soldiers, a few traders, we saw a blacksmith, etc. So not a very large population. The number of Indians obviously would have fluctuated according to the time of year. It was not a place where they would have lived permanently, but a place where they would have come for at least one period of time during the year. Let me tell you a little bit about the French and Indian relationships, because this is something that's quite different, distinct for the French from the English relationship with the Indians. They really saw it as a commercial or business relationship. It was very important for them. They needed the Indians to get the furs. So there was a real interdependency. They also needed the Indians in that if they were not to be attacked by one group of Indians, they needed to know how to have alliances among different groups of Indians. And so there was a commercial business relationship. There was also a simple need to have friendly relationships with various groups of Indians. There were Jesuits, and as I said, also the Recollet fathers who tried to convert the Indians. That was never very successful, didn't ever really take in any big way at all. But interestingly, the French did really not try to change the way of life of the Native Americans. They recognized that the Native Americans had their way of living. They had some useful products that the French wanted to buy, and that's what they were interested in. They were not going to try to civilize them in any way. They were going to deal with them as equal trading partners. Also, they were not interested in taking possession of the land, chopping down the trees, and plowing it up and farming. For the most part, the French were not doing very much of that settling. They were more interested in the furs. It was definitely an economic relationship. They were interested in getting the furs and getting the money for those, but they weren't interested in running the Indians off the land, taking it over, and settling down. Completely different way of interacting with the Native Americans. There also were frequent marriages or relationships between the French traders and Indian women. And that's the case with Joseph Bailey, we will see in the early 1800s. First of all, very few French women came out into the wilderness, as this was called. It wasn't set up that way. Extremely difficult life. Conditions were not such that women wanted to come, and they did not come for the most part. So, besides the fact that there simply were not marriage partners out here, you might have a wife back in Montreal, but she stayed there. But it was advantageous to have a relationship or a marriage with a Native American woman for a couple of reasons. First of all, for the traders, it was very advantageous because Native American society was made up very generally of kin or family networks. If I'm going to trade with my brother-in-law and my brother-in-law's brother because I know them, their family, I trust them, I'm going to give them advantages. If you're not part of my group, if you're not part of my family, then I'm not going to give you the advantages. I'm not going to be as ready to trade with you. So it's to a real advantage, to a trader's real advantage, to become part of a Native American family by having a relationship, by marrying an Indian woman, because he becomes part of her extended family and can have readier access to furs. If you think about it from the Native American point of view, the same thing is also true. It's very advantageous for you, say you have a daughter who marries a trader, you've got really good access to all of those trade goods. You know that you will have preferred access to that. So economically, it's a big advantage on both sides. So there really are quite a few of these relationships established between French and Native Americans. Sometimes they are formally married. Sometimes they are called à la façon du pays, in the manner of the country. That is kind of a common law relationship. The children are known in French as métis, mixed heritage. We don't have a real good term for it in English, and in Canada, in fact, these folks are still known as métis. And these are children who kind of grow up in both cultures and often with both languages, which makes them extremely useful in a number of ways. They can really play the role of the intermediary. They can speak French and they can speak whatever, Piankashawiya, whatever language they need to communicate with the Native Americans. Sometimes they are educated, sometimes they are sent to school and become educated and can read and write. One of these people is Claude Joseph Lagroyère, is the son of Claude Joseph Lagravère Drouet, Sieur de Richardville. His territory in Canada was called Richardville. He had a son with a Miami woman here in Indiana. She was from a very important family. His son was Jean-Baptiste Richardville, born in 1761. And he became a very, very important man after this became part of the United States and even into Indiana statehood. You can see that he would have been an adult when Indiana became a state. He played an extremely important role as intermediary, go-between, translator, fixer of things. And if you did not know where the town of Rushville gets its name, it's not because it has anything to do with Russia, and that's why it has that very peculiar pronunciation. It looks like it should be Rushville, but it's Rushville, and that's because it really is Richardville. It is named after Richardville. So there is one little example of how French remains here in Indiana. But he's an important example of these children of these mixed marriages who did play this important role commercially, culturally, etc., as intermediaries. So, since we've been talking about Fort Riatnon, here we are, Feast of the Hunter's Moon, note September. If any of you are able to get down, I took these photos maybe 2006 or 7. So just so you can see what they're like. Next one, please. Canoe, there's the flag with the fleur de lis and the reenactor there.
Would you please say the name of Feast of the Hunter's Moon in French?
Oh gosh.
They used to be called by that.
You know,
and they stopped doing that.
Yeah, I don't know exactly what it is. I can just translate it in my head, and I would say Fête de la Lune des Chasseurs. Does that sound about right? Okay. Well, it would make sense to put it in French, but they must have figured not enough people here would know what it is today. So, but certainly the tradition of that rendezvous is absolutely in the French. Next. So another post farther down on the Wabash, closer to the country of the Illinois. Down far enough that it's a little bit of a question. Are you going to send those furs back up north through Montreal, or you're just going to head them down south. It's kind of halfway in between. So I once asked a historian in Vincennes, so are you part of Canada or part of Louisiana? He says, well, we don't really know, because you can't really decide which is the better way to get the furs out. Louisiana, however, wanted this post because they wanted those furs to come down through New Orleans. And so they paid, here he is again, François-Marie Vissot, the son, Vincennes, to create a post on the Wabash. And in 1732, this is his third one, and he's only 32 years old, not bad. Post Vincennes is completed. Its role, as always, was to maintain the fur trade and also to maintain peace among and with the Indians. Interestingly, in a lot of these letters that are going back to France, there's a lot of conversation about we have to be careful because there's trouble being stirred up between this group and this group of Indians. We have to figure out some way to keep the peace. And they had ulterior motives. They wanted to keep the peace because you can't do business. You can't get the furs traded if there's war between groups. So they had a commercial motive on that. Vincennes was killed by the Chickasaws a little farther downstream, not at Vincennes, at Vincennes, but he was killed very young in 1736. But that's the origin of post-Vincennes. 1746, the population, we have 40 French, we have 5 blacks. There was slavery in France and New France at that time. About 750 Indians. Again, Indian villages always grew up around these posts, and that number is very fluid. 1767, you can see it's growing, and there are 232 people that they call habitants. So this was an area we will see where they specifically encouraged people to come and settle. They didn't just want the fur traders, they really wanted the habitants. They wanted people to do some agricultural work here. 168 what they called foreigners, traders. There might even have been some Englishmen there. And they mentioned 10 black slaves and Indians who were serving in more or less a slave role, most likely. The commander down there, his name was Saint-Ange, and he was a very savvy real estate developer in a sense. He grants land concessions and encourages habitants to come and settle and farm the land. And so that a true French village really does gradually form around this military fort with an Indian village next to it. And there is a contemporary drawing of Sieur de Vincennes directing that his fort be built. And then here is a grant, a land grant, with his signature down here. You can just barely make out it says Saint-Ange. So it's a grant of land in Vincennes. And I think that date is 1768. That looks like at the very bottom. So the village was really prosperous in these 2 decades. The furs ultimately were shipped down to New Orleans, fitting, since it was Louisiana that paid to have the post put up. There was agriculture, and the land was held more or less in common. There was a common area where cattle could graze. It was organized sort of like a French village. The residents lived in the village, and the land was farmed out of town. It's not like we often think of this model of the farm out here, and you farm land around, and there's a farm way over here with land around it. Everyone lived in town, and you walked out to your fields during the day. Very much a French village model. The houses were built in this style that I talked about before, poteau en terre, post in ground, with bousillage. I'll show you a photo of this in a second. What happens is you have these posts that are maybe this far apart, and you've got some slats between them, and you make a mixture of mud and hay or straw, and you lap that over these slats, and that fills in the spaces between those posts, and you'll see it in just a second. Have any of you been to Vincennes? Okay, good. So have you seen the old French house? So you know this. It's a wonderful place. There's a lot to see there. If you haven't been, I really recommend it. I see some heads nodding. A neat place to visit. The old French house built by the trader Michel Brouillet in 1806. It is definitely worth a visit. And there are other places to see in Vincennes as well. Got some photos here. That's what the old French house looks like. Very typical construction style with that porch in the front and the porch in the back. And then here you can see, this is the construction. Here you can see the posts, and you can just see this mud and straw that fills in that space. It's literally wrapped over those slats in the middle. Very, very typical. And you see that construction style in the French settlements from Montreal all the way down to New Orleans. You know, St. Genevieve near St. Louis, you see this kind of thing where there was a French settlement, that was the style of building. A scene, one of the rooms in the old French house, which they have furnished with period furniture. It's not from Vincennes. This was imported antiques bought in France and shipped over, but nonetheless it's from the appropriate period. And then there's the Wabash River at Vincennes, quite broad, quite wide, right there. So, fateful year 1763, at least for the French in North America. We know the French and Indian War, and if we remember our history, we remember that it was the French and Indians on one side and the British on the other side, right? Well, that war was not just happening in North America, it was really, frankly, mostly happening in Europe with the French and Allies and the British and Allies fighting. And in 1763, the war was over. France did not win. And as part of the peace treaty, they ceded all of their territory in North America to the British. So whatever was New France was no longer New France. It was all British territory, and would stay that way then, you know, for another few years at least, until the American Revolution came on, and we had the United States of America. So these forts in Indiana at that point were no longer French forts; they were English, and they just went away. We don't have a year when they stopped existing. They just became less useful. The English were not working in exactly the same ways as the French, and so these forts simply disappeared, with the one exception of Vincennes, and that had a town attached to it, and actually its military function remained important also. It played a role in the Revolutionary War, as you can learn if you go down there to visit. Also, there was a church. In fact, there was a bishop of Vincennes at one time. It was an important enough point. So there's a lovely church down there still today. So it had taken on the characteristics of a town and was a town and stayed. So here you can just see the colors. This is before 1763. Written over here, disputed territory. All of this is France. And then next, there we go, no more blue. It's all Great Britain. This is all that's in French. Excuse La Grande-Bretagne. Just a little visual to show you the change in territory there. Okay, so just a reminder, after the middle of the 18th century, this territory becomes part of the Northwest Territory. We become Indiana Territory, then the state of Indiana. Changes in population and economy. People come in and they are not marrying the Native Americans. They are removing them. They are saying, we want to use this land differently. We don't like what they're doing with it. Get them out of here. So you're very familiar with all of that. I know, particularly those of you who have worked on the dig. So end of the fur trade really in this area for a number of reasons. Agriculture becomes the most important economic engine here. Settlers come in and come to stay, and among them will be, of course, Joseph Bailey, who's going to come at the beginning of the 19th century. I won't spend very long on this. Just a reminder, there's another French presence way down in the other corner of the state, down by Vevey, Switzerland County. The Dufour family, who were French-speaking Swiss, from the canton of Vaud, which is down kind of near Lake Geneva, and they began with a vineyard. First in Kentucky, and then they came over to the northern banks of the Ohio in 1801. And they produced wine and fruit and apparently straw hats was a big seller for them for a while. They became known for their straw hat sales. And their vineyard was in operation until 1850. So we have this little tiny vestige of Switzerland down in Switzerland County in southeast Indiana. Porter County, here we go. Rich in furs, you know this, marshland around the Kankakee. A lot of opportunity to trade for furs right here. The first permanent resident, Joseph Bailey, who in about 1822 came and constructed a permanent residence for his family on the Calumet, as he called it, or what we know as the Little Calumet River near Lake Michigan. You probably know there were many Indian paths up there, so it was a, you know, we talk about the interstates today, similar kind of thing in those days. A lot of pathways through there, so that was an important place for him to settle. And you've probably all been to the Bailey Homestead. If you haven't, then I'd recommend that you go up in the Indiana Dunes National Lake Shore. So a little bit about Joseph Bailey himself. He was born in 1774, died in 1835, and as you know is buried up here. He worked in the fur trade. He was what we would call a voyageur. I didn't mention that name when I was talking about the fur trade route, but the guys who were doing the paddling in the canoes are often known with the French word of voyageur, which means traveler. And so that was his business, was the fur trade. He was born in Quebec, near Montreal. His family was not a hugely successful family, but fairly well known. His sister became a lady-in-waiting to the Governor-General of Canada, so a fairly important family. He was based for most of his career out of Michilimackinac, which is how Mackinac was known back in those days. So that was where he was based, but he did a lot of traveling. He was doing a lot of his trading in Michigan, what is today Michigan, down here into the Kankakee area. I mentioned a little bit also into the Illinois River area. He did some trading up north as well. There are some documents that have him doing some business with some folks up on the shores of Lake Superior. So kind of a lot of the upper Midwest, but really primarily Michigan and then this part of Indiana. He was married twice. Both of his wives were métis, or of mixed heritage. They both had a trader father and an Indian mother. And among his children, of his first wife is a son named Alexis, who went off to Minnesota and became extremely important in the founding of the state of Minnesota. He was one of the first state legislators in Minnesota. And one of his daughters, by his second wife, Eleanor, you may know this, she became a nun. His children were very well educated, went to Catholic schools. And she was a nun at the St. Mary of the Woods convent down by Terre Haute. And in fact, she became the second Mother Superior of that particular convent. So Joseph Bailey then was working for almost all of his career in the United States. But he did not become an American citizen until 1817, sort of after the war of 1812. It seemed useful to be an American citizen. He clearly had been trading here for a long time. Even the copy of the volume of his account books that I've been working with, I'll tell you about that in just a sec, mentions the Kankakee. But he didn't settle here until 1822, and it seems pretty clear that it was at that point that you could get land and you could settle here. And that's what he was interested in doing. Second part of his life, the first part of his life, fur trade, following this sort of traveling all the time, lots of movement. But then the second half of his life, he settles down and becomes, at least tries to become a land developer, among other things. He purchases some land, names it Baileytown, has it all platted out with the streets. It never came to be, but he had plans for it. He died before it could come to fruition. So for me, that's kind of and he's kind of an interesting symbol of the difference between the way in which the French were interacting with the land and the Native Americans. and the way in which the English and finally the Americans were interacting with the land. The French were coming in, were taking the furs, but weren't really settling it very much. We Americans came in, we founded cities, we founded towns, and it's a completely different way of interacting, I think, with the people and with the land. Next. The project that I have worked on is a translation of a volume of Joseph Bailey's account books. The books start at what's probably the beginning of his fur trade career, 1796, and they go clear up till 1832. Have any of you seen this volume? It's the one volume that's locally owned. It's up in the museum in Valpo, the Old Jail Museum. Have any of you seen that? Okay, yeah. It's about 2001, 2002, some folks at the museum called the university and they said, we'd really like to know what's in this account book. It's in French. It says journal on the front of it. This could be really interesting. Could we find a student to translate it? And someone routed that call to me and I said, you know what, I'm not going to give that to a student, I'll do that myself. So I undertook to first transcribe and then translate into English this one volume of the account books. There are a total, I think, of 44 of them. The other 43 are down in Indianapolis. And they are all account books. They are not journals. He's not, writing about his life. He's literally keeping his accounts of what he purchased to trade with the Indians, who he hired to go out and trade with the Indians, what he needed to purchase to outfit those men, the clothing, the food, etc., and then the lists of the furs that he purchased and how much they were worth and how many of them there were. He carefully records where he was, where he had his little trading posts, where he was sending out his expeditions. And among the place names that we see are a number of spots in Michigan, the Grand River. He had a couple of posts on the Grand River. Also, we see Manistee. We see a place that is spelled, and I'll pronounce it in the French way, Kikalimazo. You can figure out what that is. Kalamazoo, exactly. There must have been something there. There is a trading post that was just north of South Bend, which is called Le Parc des Vaches, the cow park. It's kind of a bend in the river where there's a flat grassy spot, and it was a clearing, and it was grazed not by regular cows but by bison. So that's why it's called Parc aux Vaches. So there was a little trading post there, and Bailey does mention trading with that spot as well, or trading at that spot as well. So here are the things that we have in his account books, complete with prices, et cetera, et cetera. And I have put up on the table here a photocopy of what that volume looks like, so you can see his handwriting. Beautiful handwriting, usually pretty easy to read. Not always. Sometimes he has some kind of creative spelling, but nonetheless, I invite you to take a look at that. Next. Here's what the covers of these books look like. If you've seen the one up in the museum, they don't always have it closed, so you may not have seen that, but it's just a little bit smaller than a legal-size sheet of paper. That's a life-size photocopy there, and you can see it's on legal-size paper. It's a fairly kind of cheap paper-covered, cardboard-covered book, and almost all of the volumes are just like that. It must have been a pretty standard bound volume, sort of cheap bound volume that you might get at the time. And you can see here this bee in a diamond. All fur traders had a symbol, like a logo, that they could imprint on the barrels or the bales, covered with a tarp, that they were going to send the furs in, or that they were getting the supplies in. So you could tell whose it was, so you could identify it. And that's his symbol, so he has that on the cover of all of his account books. You can't see this very well, but we have a list here of merchandise, and this is a whole variety of kinds of merchandise. These would have been trade goods that he was purchasing, that he was then going to trade with the Indians. Out here we have the amount, so that we have, right here we have, I believe that's a number 4, bas-feu. Those are fire steels, the things that you hit, to make the spark. And so we've got here, the number of them is 4, and then this is the price. and then there's the extended price, so the total. And then he's going to add it all up and carry it all over to the next page. So among the things, many things that we have on this page and throughout the book, we have merchandise, we have a lot of different kinds of fabric, cotton, wool, different lengths. Some he identifies as upholstery fabric. Some of it is calico, so various kinds of fabric. Handkerchiefs, some are cotton, some are silk. Mirrors, some of which have a metal frame to them, some of which have a cardboard frame. Earrings, bracelets also, and other decorative items. Metal things like scissors, buttons, flints, and as I said, the fire steels that you might use with the flint. Combs, kettles, knives of all kinds, butcher knives, pen knives, even a sort of what he calls a spring-loaded knife, which, what are those called, the spring-loaded knives? Switchblades, yes, indeed. So those even show up from time to time. And here is a list of the furs, and this is just one shipment, and they're called peltries, pelteries, or furs, and he's got them listed here. We have, this is deer, this is the word for cat, chat, but they're not actually cats. Do you know what that word is? It's sort of cat-sized. Oh, thank you. Sorry. Either way, wildcat, raccoon, exactly. Chat sauvage is what they were called. People see this and they say, "Oh my gosh, they were hunting cats?" No, this is raccoons. So we've also got fox, we've got martens, we've got some mink, we've got otters, we've got bears, we've got bear cubs, and we've got beaver. And again, you've got quantities here. You may be able to see some of these. This top one is the deer, 1,336 deer skins. Versus, this is down here, this is 10 bears, 6 bear cubs, 132 muskrats. And down here at the bottom is castor, C-A-S-T-O-R, is beaver. And he has 65 pounds of beaver. And the beaver are not counted individually, but weighed, because the heavier pelts are more valuable. So it's really the pounds as opposed to the individual pelts that count when you're purchasing them. So here he has the price per pelt. And you can see this one, which is worth 24 of the economic units, they're pounds, or livres. This is the bear, that's worth 24. Otters are worth 22 pounds. These muskrats are only worth 1 pound and 10 shillings equivalents. The currency that he's using is one that was used throughout the fur trade, even it was the old French currency. So even though it wasn't France anymore, and this even, he was working in the United States, they still figured things, figured values in this old French system, which is absolutely parallel to the old English system. You may remember pounds and shillings and pence. It's exactly the same quantities in this livre and écu. So the very parallel system. Jim?
What period of time would that cover for these in the account book? Is this for like a season or for a month?
It's not completely clear to me. My sense is this is probably what was collected during one season at one little spot,
Right.
but it's really not clear. In this one volume, I should backtrack a little and say this one volume that I've translated covers from 1799 through 1802. So towards the beginning of his career, in a couple of years, kind of about 2 years. And there are probably, I should count this up so that I know for sure, maybe 10 similar lists of furs here. So there's not one on every page, but they're not terribly uncommon. Yes?
Was he working for somebody during that time period?
He was
or
not.
as his
He
own?
was an independent trader. There were traders who worked for companies, like the Northwest Company, for instance, or John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company a little bit later on. And they had people who worked for them, but he was an independent trader.
So he
had
did
some
not
men
have a
who were-
partner or anything like that?
He did partner with some people. The one post that he was cooperating on up in Lake Superior, he was working with a guy named Rousseau, and he partnered with him a number of times. So yeah, I think there were sort of temporary partnerships. They didn't partner up in everything, but they might have one job that they were working on that they would partner on. Maybe they could get a little more capital together for a
And
particular
this was at
job.
Mackinac?
He was based at Mackinac at this time, exactly right, yep. And so that in this particular volume of the account books, the place names that we see are almost all Michigan and Kankakee and one Illinois, and there's one reference to a trip to Vincennes.
But you don't believe he was working for Montreal Fur Traders or for
No,
merchants
he
at
was
that
working,
time
he was
as an
absolutely
independent?
working with a guy up in Montreal who was his business partner in that he was the one who arranged for the furs to get sent on to Europe. He was the one who arranged for him to purchase the trade goods in Montreal. But it was just a partnership in that way. He was not working for anyone else. He was independent.
But he didn't contract as a bourgeois or a voyageur?
Pardon?
He did not contract as a bourgeois or a voyageur?
He was kind of the equivalent of the bourgeois, yeah. And the bourgeois were this kind of middlemen in the large fur companies, because you'd have big guys at the top and the middle managers, and then you'd have the voyageurs, the guys who were traveling. So he was the equivalent of the bourgeois on his own. I have not seen any evidence. I've done some work up at Mackinac in their archives, and I don't see any evidence of his working for anyone. In fact, throughout the account books, he's working as an independent operator. But he's working, I mean, that you're right in that he's working in the level of the bourgeois, that he is sending out these little expeditions of men who work for him for at least a season. Right. Yeah.
Did they get taxed back then by the government?
That's a good question. I don't know.
Or when they were working for France, did they get a cut of it?
That's extremely complicated. When the,
Right.
when the French were running the fur trade system, they kept trying different models. For a while, at the very beginning, they wanted to make all the Indians come up to Montreal. Well, then that wasn't working for a while, and so they tried to only send out a limited number of guys. You had to get a permit to go out, and that worked for a while, and then they realized there were a lot of those guys who were going out without permits. They were called the coureurs du bois, or the runners of the woods. And so they tried reconfiguring it in different ways. They set the prices for the furs. They needed to do that because they needed to keep some control over the fur trade, and they had to kind of figure out how much the English were paying and set their prices accordingly. And again, these prices, the individual prices on the furs, I don't know exactly how this system works, but they are not prices that Bailey himself would have set. They would be, I suppose Jim, you might call it price fixing. So that it would have been standard, so that you had some equity among the different traders. It was sort of a bit of organization in that way. I'm not an economist, so or a historian of business, so I can't tell you exactly how that worked. But these prices for the furs remain constant. All of the lists in this book have the same prices for the individual furs. Yeah.
Have you run across any mention of bobcat or link?
Yes, very few of them. There are some links. There are not very many of them, and are there any on here?
Well, it says wildcat. But,
Yeah.
But you said that was
Yeah,
raccoon.
this is called what they literally call a wild cat, or savage cat is what it looks like, and that's a raccoon. It's this one, the pichou is the lynx, and he's got quite a few of them. He's got 22 there, but they're only worth 3 pounds. So it's kind of exotic, but it must not have been worth much on the market. You must not have been able to sell it for very much. So yes, they do show up. A lot of these are animal. I don't know how many of these animals you would have found readily around here. These are from up on the Grand River, so these are up from farther north in Michigan in particular. Yeah.
Quite often you see swan skin in the records. What was the usage of that?
You're right, that's something that you see in the British, and I've not seen it in Bailey, so I don't quite know what the swan skin would have been used for, if that would have been
Like for windows, perhaps?
windows, maybe, I don't know, something to do with the feathers. But you're right, now that you think about it, now that I think about it, you see that in the English lists of trading of this exact time as swan skin. Not enough of an expert to be able to tell you what that is, and there's not an equivalent in Bailey's list, so sorry, can't answer that one for you. Other questions at this point? Yeah.
What's a fisher?
A fisher.
What is that?
It is an animal sort of like a wolverine.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. In fact, I was just on the internet looking this one up recently again, sort of reminding myself about it. And the French word for it, French Canadian word for it, is piquant. And I went on a website, French Canadian website, where you could ask questions about animals. And a bunch of folks were writing in, I mean this was starting last August and ending in December, writing in and saying, we're having terrible problems with piquant in our neighborhood. We live out on the edge of town and our cats keep disappearing. You know, so it's sort of like the coyotes coming in and taking your house pets. So the piquant, these fishers are still there and very much predators, like a wolverine would be on another animal. They're slightly smaller than a wolverine.
What's the martin?
Pardon?
What's the martin?
Martin is a weasel-like animal, sort of mink, weasel, that kind of fur.
Yeah.
So, there are also some instances in here of what they call dressed skins, and I think that those were tanned by the Native Americans before they came in. They were not just dried, but in fact had undergone a sort of a tanning process by the Native Americans before they were traded. So, next. Okay. I'm kind of moving on to some other spots, but I don't want to cut off any more questions about Bailey if you have any right now too. But some other spots in Indiana that have a French presence. In South Bend, a trading post was founded there. The French Canadians had a tradition of being traders, continuing in the fur trade and other things, and so this was Pierre Navarre, who settled there in 1820, and today it is South Bend. And then I mentioned Le Parc aux Vaches, the cow park, trading post established there in 1790. And then you are, I'm sure, familiar with Trail Creek in Michigan City, also known as Rivière du Chemin, that's the original name, literally means trail river, Trail Creek. And a trading post was established there. Jean-Baptiste Point de Sable, you know, the Du Sable Museum in Chicago, know that he was at the founding of Chicago, and he traded at Rivière du Chemin, among other places. So there's more French presence in this part of Indiana. So there's the map of the state with all of these spots. Vivi down here, Vincennes, Terre Haute, which is, we'll see Joseph Bailey's daughter, who was the Mother Superior at the convent there, Ouiattnon up by West Lafayette, and all of the spots up here in the north. And I think I've got about one more slide, yes.
And of South Bend, would not the father of South Bend, Caillard?
Here we go. Founding of Notre-Dame du Lac with Reverend Edward Sorin in 1842. They may regret having that lake name there. I don't know, with all the lake effect snow that they get. That's the name literally means Our Lady of the Lake. So they sort of sealed their fate with that name. So the French sent out missionaries in the 19th century, and a number of them did come to Indiana and obviously founded this school, which became the University of Notre Dame. And do you know more about the founding of the city of South Bend? Because I'm not familiar with the history
Actually, it
of
was
the
founded
city.
much earlier that by the brother of the Bishop of Detroit,
Okay. Very good.
Brute. He came down here first, and what had happened is several chiefs went to Detroit, prostrated themselves before the bishop, He said his brother and a mission was started on this exact spot, and the main reason it was is because he was old. And so there was actually an Indian village there. They gave it up, built a cabin there for him because they didn't want him to walk too far for the water. So there was actually 2 priests before that. Marie Petit was here also in Marshall County, connected to this same thing, and then also with the Poke up in Dowagiac, before Sorensen came in 1842.
Great, wonderful. I knew there would be experts here who knew a lot more about some of this than I, for sure. Thank you. And next slide, I guess. So Mother Theodore Guérin arrives. She's part of that French missionary wave, which these folks were part of in the 19th century. Founded the Sisters of Providence and then the Academy of St. Mary the Woods in 1841. And Holy Mother Theodore Guérin, and she became a saint just about 2 years ago. And the second Mother Superior of that congregation was Eleanor Bailey. Mother Mary Cecilia, you see her photo there. So she is the daughter of Joseph Bailey, daughter with his second wife, Marie. And let's see if there's anything else. I think that's it. Discover Indiana's French heritage. And clearly, from what you have said, there is way more to discover. This is sort of just the edge of it, but I've gone on for a really long time. So I will stop and take any other questions that you have. Yes?
Was there any connection, like you go up to Mackinac City, they have a lot of Hudson Bay fur trading. Was there any connection to Hudson Bay at all?
The Hudson's Bay Company was a major company in the fur trade from the kind of middle of the 1700s on. It was a British company, and they, a larger part of their trade was farther north and west. And they didn't have as much involvement trading down here, but they were absolutely one of the big fur trade companies, along with the Northwest Company, a little later on the American Fur Company. Those were kind of the big conglomerates, we might say. So yes, I don't know that they did a lot down here, but probably some.
Probably the reason they ain't connected because one's French and one's British, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
You might want to come, our April program that's going to be doing on the trade blankets. I know the Hudson Bay blankets is one of her, I think she's got examples of it also. You might be interested in coming.
Well, it's hard to believe they did all that trading back in the primitive times like that. All that stuff could be moved around and just water to move it on.
It's incredible. They had huge 40-foot canoes. They could put up to a ton of merchandise in a canoe. You can imagine the kind of shape those guys must have been in to paddle those canoes on the lakes and rivers.
I don't know if you go see all that stuff. There's a place called, actually in Canada, Thunder Bay. What's that called? Fort Williams.
Yes, I've heard of that.
Well, if anybody's interested in this kind of stuff, that's where to go. It's like it's unbelievable. They got them 40-foot canoes, and then they got the 35-foot ones. They're all handmade out of birch bark. That's really interested in this stuff. That's where to go. That Fort Williams. It's still there. It's a big fort and
Great.
It's gigantic. Take you all day to go through all that stuff.
So if this little itty bitty taste has whet your appetite, head up north for that. I also should say, you're saying the birch bark reminds me that I have on the table here an example of a container that's called a mokok, the Indian name for it. One of the things that you see a lot of in Joseph Bailey's account books is huge quantities of maple sugar. And the maple sugar was stored in and transported in these birch bark containers, much bigger than that. That's a little tiny mini one. And I at first could not figure out why they needed to have so much sugar. What were they eating that needed so much sugar? And I finally realized, wait a minute, they're not eating it. They're shipping it out along with the furs. It's a commodity that they're trading. It's something that gets produced here and shipped out. So you'll have hundreds of pounds of maple sugar that's getting shipped out.
Essentially, one bush could produce 1,600 pounds.
Wow, yeah. Yeah, Jim?
The account books are a little late for this, 1799, but was there any evidence you came across where the goods were denominated in furs as opposed to currency?
The only place where that happens is there are different kinds of account books. Those of you who do bookkeeping know that you have your day book and you have your, the one that splits it into accounts.
Right.
And he has some books where he keeps records of the trades that he made with individual Native Americans. So, with person X, he said, brought in 14 muskrat skins and traded that for, so much gunpowder. And he brought in 3 pounds of beaver and traded that for 1 pot or something like that. So you do have that in just a couple of the account books. You have it to that level of detail.
Because knowing the British, probably the tax was when the furs arrived in Europe at the British port.
Okay.
Also as a way to competitively keep the French furs out, the British furs in.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, the tax question was a good one. There had to be tax somewhere along the line. You never avoid taxes. Yeah.
These books, the account books, you said they were made out of cardboard?
Well, they're regular paper. The covers are cardboard. They're not like nice leather bound.
200 years they've survived. Where did they survive this period of time?
Well, they were, after Bailey's death, they were simply held by his family, as far as I know. And when the last member of the family who was living here in the area died in the early 20th century, I need to ask someone who is familiar with the history of the old jail museum, but someone said, we need to have one of those, and so they purchased one, and the rest were purchased and then donated to the Indiana State Library. So they've been down there for, gosh, close to 100 years now in the State Library or in the museum here. But in that sort of 70 years between his death and that, they were just kept by the family. And kept very well, you're right. Yeah.
Where's the Indiana State Library at?
It's in Indianapolis. It's right next door to the Capitol building. It's a really neat
That'd be
place to
something
go.
to see that goes,
Yeah.
it's got all this stuff down there.
Absolutely. You
Okay.
can request them. You have the right. You can get the call number and you go. It's in the rare book area. You give them the indication of what you want to see, and they'll wheel it out for you. You can take a look at it. Yeah.
We have a story in this area. I'm surprised these guys didn't. And I guess my question is, and if you go to our website, I have a story, and if you do a search, it's Porter County's first fortification, I think is the title of it. But it's supposed to be a French fort. Now, there's all kinds of stories on these forts. Now, what is kind of the story along the Kankakee? Same thing I've been led to understand, like be 2 guys, and they were here, and then 10 miles later on. But what's more of the story, and can it tie into? I mean, the story we have is that during the French-Indian Wars, there's a story of 14 guns and all this business, but it has been surveyed, and we do. It's a real. I've been there, and it's just straight north of his property. But so what's the story on these little French forts like Kankakee?
Well, there is another mention somewhere of a fort that's somewhere up near the lake called the Petite Fort, and no one really knows anything about it. I have not done a thorough enough search in these documents. I showed you the letter that said St. Philippe of the Miami, and there's just hundreds of those letters. Where you can see, the Weatanon is mentioned there, this post is mentioned there, St. Joseph is mentioned there. So they're writing about these forts, and other people have read through these letters in detail. I have not. I've just looked at them pretty superficially, and have not come up with any others. So there just isn't evidence. I mean, there's not evidence that they didn't exist. But they're not named, nobody mentions them, so it's hard to know if they existed or not. Certainly they would have been small. I mean, even the big ones were small, as we've seen. Even the ones that really played an important role didn't have very many people and wouldn't have covered very much square footage. So it's possible, they're just not, we just don't see any written evidence of it. I think that's the problem.
Sort of tie into one of the other questions is, I know there's a lot of translations through the Glenn Black Museum, and they're translated from the French, and they go back to the 1700s of this area, and I've done some searching there, but if you do a search at the Glenn Black Museum, you can come up and read these translations. Kind of interesting.
Yeah.
There was a fort, but there were a lot of landings along the Campee that was used for trading posts.
Certainly possible.
Yeah, there was. There
Yeah,
was one
absolutely.
over by Route 39 called Chambers Landing, where they just traded, but there wasn't forts.
Yeah, and you know, you think about it, these things must have existed informally for a long time and might have been used for a while and then weren't used for a while and then got used again. So the question is, you know, was there a formal named spot? Not that that's crucially important, it's just interesting. Was there a you know, a formal named spot there where people said, yes, this is our French fort? And that's what you kind of look for evidence of in these written documents and see what you can find, and sometimes you locate it and sometimes you don't.
There's a lot of ground conservation area. It's east there, it's called Turkey Foot, I believe.
Okay,
And it mentioned something about LaSalle. I passed through that area.
okay, yeah, yeah.
And it's kind of neat over there.
Yeah.
Another question I want to ask that buffet,
Yes,
you said the French Swiss put vineyards down there. to start.
Yeah, it was this Dufour family who were from the French-speaking part of Switzerland who came over, and what they knew how to do was winemaking. So they,
Are they still there?
no, no. There may be descendants there, but if they are, they're not, you know, not like major citizens or anything. They, you know,
The vineyards, they're not there anymore.
no, they ceased production in 1850s, something like that.
You had mentioned that DeSable was trading with people at Trail Creek.
Right,
Is it reasonable to assume that they were, you know, that the voyageurs were traveling by canoe along the edge of the lake to get between Chicago and Trail Creek?
right, absolutely, yeah.
So if like there were big storms or whatnot, they might have come in and
Yeah,
made a camp on the beach or in.
Sure, absolutely. There may have been spots where it made some sense to go on land rather than on the water, but yeah, it would have been, would have made a lot of sense to be going back and forth from his trading post at Chicago to Trail Creek along the edge of Lake Michigan. And certainly the furs being traded there would have come, some of them would have come from around here. So there's, you know, there's just a connection there. There's between this area and DuSable and his trading in Chicago and at Trail Creek and the other places where he traded as well. All of these fur traders were very mobile. They were all over the place, so. Yeah.
You said they traded goods with the Indians. Did they also do their own trapping and hunting and?
No.
So none of the French were trappers?
No, they were not. They did not do the trapping themselves, and that makes them a little different from some later. You hear about the mountain men and, you know, out in the Rockies doing their trapping, and I don't really know much about that period at all. But no, these folks were not doing the trapping themselves. They were counting on the experts to do that, and they would trade the goods for them. And that was something that I learned as well. I hadn't realized that. Another question, please go ahead.
Yeah, I've got one more.
Sure.
Do you know anything, I know this is Indiana, but the Illinois-Indiana kind of connection, Lavasseur or Gordon Hubbard, one of the founders of Chicago, like, who worked for John Jacob Astor, do you know any of that tie-in? 'Cause
I
it was
do.
kind of like they worked right along the border of Indiana and
Absolutely,
Illinois.
absolutely, and
trading
he's, and you know, Hubbard and those guys are a little bit later, but there's the Mackinac connection is definitely there.
Okay.
And what I can recommend, there's a book that I have up here on the table that is a memoir written by a woman who was very connected with the founders of Chicago and traders out of Mackinac, and then she spent some time, her husband was an Indian agent in Portage, Wisconsin.
Okay.
So that's a really fascinating memoir about growing up in Mackinac and then early Chicago. So kind of leaf through that. It's really interesting. Yeah, it's all interconnected there. Absolutely. Yeah.
Jumping to Mackinac, the island there, who built the fort there, the English or the French?
The French first built the fort, but not on the island. They built it on the mainland, on the southern tip. And that, if you've been there, you may have visited Fort Michilimackinac, which is, it's the archaeological site where that fort was up until the French weren't there anymore in the mid-1700s. So it's an archaeological site, but they have also reconstructed the palisade and a number of the buildings so that you can visit them and learn a lot about the fur trade, go into a fur trader's house, go into the church, etc. So the French first built there, and then when it became British territory, they built a fort, and they built their fort on the island, and that fort on the southern
the
shore.
English built the fort?
Yep,
on
the
the
English,
island?
they built their fort second. The French were there first, and then the British, and they definitely built a fort. It was an important spot, yeah.
Isn't there also a time, just a few years ago, this was part of Spain?
Yes, because, and I'm not gonna get the chronology right on this, excuse me, but it had to do with when the French, France got back part of Louisiana, and it became part of the Louisiana Purchase. And in between times, New Orleans was Spanish territory for a number of years in there. So I'll send you all to your history books to look for the chronology of that. But yes, Spain did play a little role, absolutely. Yeah. I'll let the Spanish professors tell you about that. Excuse me.
I have one more question about the forts. Because I read somewhere that Fort Dearborn was built to protect the fur trade. Was that similar to the forts in Indiana? Was it for the same purposes?
Right, exactly. It was to protect the fur trade. It was to provide a kind of a stable place where Indians would feel comfortable coming, sort of like a magnet to attract them there. It was also to provide a presence with soldiers so that they could kind of keep the peace and have it be a peaceful area rather than a place where there are always battles and skirmishes coming up. So it's kind of a number of functions rolled into one, and it just made sense to send soldiers in and to have this fort. So it wasn't as though the traders were being attacked by the Native Americans all the time, because it was the Native Americans were trading with them. But there were times when there was conflict. And so it was useful to have that military force and that military presence there. Even though, 12 soldiers, 24 soldiers, not that many, but still, yeah, same kind of role. Yeah.
And when did they cede the land to the British? Was that in the late 17th?
1763, right. Mm-hmm. Yep, the Treaty of Paris, 1763. If you've ever been up to Quebec City, that up on the heights above the river there, the St. Lawrence, you have where that decisive battle was, where the General Montcalm met his defeat, and that was kind of a deciding North American battle of that particular war. So yeah, 1763.
Was that the same time that Napoleon War was going on in Europe?
No, that was the very beginning of the 1800s. Napoleon was right around 1800.
I thought maybe it had something to do with them giving them land up over here.
It did, but it had to do with making the Louisiana Purchase possible to the United States. So we're talking, what is that, about a 40-year difference between the two.
Okay.
Yeah, the first one, the French Revolution had not yet happened, so they were still kings at that point. It was Louis the 15th, I think, at that point. And then Napoleon came about 40 years later. But you're absolutely right. All of those things have to do with getting land transferred from one country to another.
We're gonna have to break it off because in about 10 minutes, less than 10 minutes, they start flicking the lights on.
Thanks so much for your attention.
So, if you